And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about Dice Throne, and specifically I am going to do another in-depth review and analysis of a Dice Throne hero. And today's hero is my favorite out of the Season 2 Battle Chest, and that is the Artificer. Before I talk about any specifics with this kit though, I want there to be two concepts at the top of your mind. There is such a thing as a hybrid play pattern with the Artificer. You can mix these two concepts together, but generally speaking, you're going to be thinking about your play in that sort of classic who's the beatdown, who's the control kind of way. So based on your matchup, and to some degree this could change a little bit within matchups as you hit different phases of the game, but generally speaking, based on your matchup, you're going to be choosing to do one of two things. You are either going to be dumping all your synth into getting Shockbot upgraded and trying to power down the opponent super aggressively. If you're not familiar with Shockbot or Synth, if this is your first experience with the character, I will explain all of these details. But just think of it as there's one play mode where you're being as aggressive as possible and you're essentially racing to beat the other opponent down before they can do the same to you. And that's your entire focus is on being the beatdown. The other path is more of a control path where you're going to be focused on doing a little more healing. You're going to be focused on trying to hit your opponent in kind of unconventional ways, maybe smaller damage values, but overall you're going to be distributing that damage to your opponent in ways where their defense isn't as relevant. So these are the two main tracks. Now again, based on matchup and board state, there could be some crossover between the aggressive and the control approach, and we're going to talk about both approaches throughout this review, but these are the two main concepts you need to have in your mind to really get your grasp on the Artificer. So the first thing we're going to talk about that is specific to the character is we're going to take a look at their character pamphlet. Now this pamphlet has a lot going on, so I don't always zoom in on the pamphlets, but for this guy we are going to because there's so much important information here. But looking at the dice layout here, he's got the 3-2-1 dice face, which is really the easiest, most forgiving type of dice face within Dice Throne. And now let's get right into what makes the Artificer who he is. So to start off with, we have this resource of Synth. Now this is exactly a currency. I'm probably gonna, and credit to Argon Jedit for this and his excellent series. I always want to give a plug to that series. If you are interested in getting better at Dice Throne characters, Board Game Geek, on the forums, there is a article written on every single one of these characters that does an excellent job in breaking down what you should be thinking about. And a lot of his opinions are backed up with math and actually crunching the numbers, whereas I tend to take more of the approach of what feels right to me. So I wanted to give credit to Argon for firmly establishing the term economy as another way to rate and think about Dice Throne characters. He's certainly not the only one who has done it, so I don't want to steal credit from anybody else. But within his most recent update on that series of articles, he rates all the characters along economy. And Artificer is one of those characters who not only has the same kind of economy as other characters with combat points and cards, he also has a sub-economy, which is this status effect called Synth. Now Synth is a positive status effect. You can spend it during the main phase for a couple of different effects. You can either use it to build bots, upgrade bots, or activate bots, or there's cards that let him spend it, so you can but it is at its core a currency, and it is the life's blood of this character. When we get to the point where we're talking about how to counteract the Artificer, spoiler alert, you attack his Synth. So this is a critical resource. It's really, really important that you manage Synth well, and that you don't allow your opponent to disrupt your synth flow too terribly. Whereas some characters can get really throttled on combat points, the Artificer can get really throttled on synth. And if you can't manage this resource, either because you make misplays or because your opponent has counterplay that interferes with how your synth is able to be used throughout the course of the game, those are probably the games you're going to lose. It's very, very critical to manage his sub-economy effectively. Next up, I want to talk about nanites. Now, nanites are not as important for the Artificer until they are. Along the beatdown track, if you are coming out and you are trying to do as much damage as fast as possible, nanites probably won't come into play more than maybe like the finishing blow. They'll be the little bit of damage that pushes you over to lethal. But if you're taking the more slow-paced control style Artificer track, and the reason you would do that is based on matchup, and I'll get to that in a minute. then nanites are going to become more important. You're going to be inflicting them more often, and you're going to be relying on the detonate damage that they produce quite a bit more in order to capture those wins. Any hero where you're afraid of attacking into their defense, these are heroes where the nanites come in much more into play. So the nanites themselves are a negative status effect that you can have up to 3 of them. The Artificer, and this is really important timing, during the upkeep phase, so before you draw cards, before you have your income, before you get that CP, before you gain that extra synth, which we'll talk about, you can detonate these nanites. Now, most of the time, the timing, as long as you do it at the beginning of your turn, nobody's going to care. But in a tournament setting, it does really matter. If you don't have the synth to pay for the nanite detonation until after your income phase, then you don't have the synth to detonate the nanites full stop. You have to do it during the upkeep. You can have a variety of different results from these, either 1, 3, or 5 damage. Obviously, getting the full stack of 3 nanites and being able to detonate them for 5 damage is the ideal play. It's because the cost of the detonation is the same, whether it's 1 or 3 nanites that you're detonating. So obviously, it's more cost effective, it's more efficient to always go for that 5 burst, but you're not always going to be able to. One of the drawbacks to the nanites is your opponent can very much see this damage coming. They know that you're going to want to go for the most efficient one, so a lot of times opponents will wait to use their status removal until you get that 3 stack, and that's when they'll clear things off. That's when if they're afraid of the nanites. In most matchups, your opponent doesn't care about nanites because they're attacking your synth, and that's their path to victory. So nanites are important to this character, and they will definitely capture you some wins in certain matchups and particular games, but overall, the nanites are much less, orders of magnitude less important than your synth management. And now we get into the real bread and butter of the character. Let's break down how all bots are built. All bots cost you 2 synth to build the basic side. The basic side of any bot is going to use 2 tokens to activate. If you invest another 3 synth in that same bot, it takes 1 token to activate. So the only difference between basic and advanced is how much they hit your economy as the Artificer. It doesn't have any difference as far as the effect that the bots have. The nano bot is the bot that allows you to detonate the nanites. So if you don't have this bot constructed, you will not be able to use any of the nanites no matter how many you have applied. So the nano bot, again, during upkeep, I want to stress that, is able to detonate those nanites on your opponent. Until you have it built, you can't detonate nanites. Shockbot, I would argue, is the most important, not only the most important bot, easily the most important bot, but it's also one of the most important components of this entire character. And the basic side, it costs you 2 synth to add 3 damage to your attack, and once you flip him over, which you should be doing immediately, it should be the absolute priority is to have an upgraded and advanced Shockbot in play as fast as possible. And basically every Artificer game, regardless of which track you're going down, the Shockbot is super important. And for the cost of 1 synth, you can add 3 damage to any attack. This is really strong, and this bot is the core of what makes the Artificer so dangerous and so adept at the damage race. This Shockbot is probably single-handedly the reason. Well, no, it's not fair to say single-handedly. If all the rest of his abilities on his dashboard did terrible damage, Shockbot wouldn't be good enough. But based on the whole tapestry of the character, the Shockbot is the thing that I think pushes his damage numbers into the place where the Artificer is perfectly comfortable in the damage race, even with the most aggressive characters in the game. I would argue that the Pyromancer, which is probably the most single damage output focused character in the whole game, is dead even with the Artificer. I think the matchup between Artie Pyro is a coin flip. It's a 50-50, and often it ends in a draw. I think more than most other matchups in the game, that the race where anytime the Artificer is just in a full out race with another extremely high damage number hero, it feels like a coin flip. The final bot is the heal bot. Now there's a couple of things to keep in mind with the heal bot. One, you can't use this in response to an ultimate. Even though it says you're doing it after you've been attacked, it's still a response. You can't do it in response to an ultimate. This is the only bot that you're able to activate twice in a turn, and it can only be activated during the defense, like after you've been attacked. And you have to be attacked with an attack of 6 damage or more. So those types of heroes like Ninja, who can produce a lot of attacks that are maybe lower damage, but are undefendable, so they completely sidestep your defense, which when we get to it, you'll see is another means of synth production, and they can stay under that 6 damage threshold. The games might take a little bit longer, but that is a way to play against an Artificer that really shuts down kind of everything he's doing on your turn in the game. All right, so now that we've walked through the pamphlet, I just now realized in editing that after describing when you could use the healbot, I went on a tangent talking about how good the ninja is at shutting down some of the things the Artificer does, and I utterly failed to address what healbot does. So healbot, when you're attacked for 6 or more damage, you roll 1 die. If you get a wrench, which you have a 50% chance of getting because his die face is 3, 2, 1. If you get a wrench, you heal 1. If you get a gear or a lightning, you heal 2. You're able to activate this twice each time you're attacked, so often you really want to, you should activate this twice. If you activate it the maximum number of times allowed, you will heal guaranteed 2. Sometimes you'll get 4, and somewhat more often than that, you'll get 3. So overall, you'll probably average out somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 healing here. It seems like it wouldn't be super impactful over the course of the game, but it adds up. This is a very important bot, and if you're on the control schematics track, you may even consider prioritizing healbot over shockbot based on the matchup. We are going to take a look at the Artificer's full board. As always, the art's great. I really particularly like the Bride of Frankenstein style stripe down the Artificer's hair. Oh, you know what? We did actually forget one other thing. And I might be accused of doing this on purpose, but if you look at the pamphlet here, above the dice, you do not see setup instructions. Starting with the Marvel set, they started putting setup instructions on the front of the pamphlet, and this is really smart. Because if you're like me, or this meme, you often forget that the Artificer starts with 3 synth. The setup instructions for this are on the back of the pamphlet. Not the ideal place, but we are seeing the designers of Dice Throne learn with each iteration of the game. And when Season 2 initially came out, setup instructions were still on the back. They've since found a better way to do that, and I totally applaud them moving in that direction. But as an Artificer player, it's really important to keep in mind you have that initial synth. Okay, so let's start to get into the fun stuff. Let's talk about what the Artificer actually does, starting with his Spanner Strike. So this is one of the best basic attacks in the entire game. So in its base form, it's a 3, 4, 5 damage, which doesn't feel that good. I totally acknowledge that those printed numbers right there feel a little on the weak side. But the rest of what this ability does really makes up for kind of the lukewarm damage that we get in the 3, 4, 5 spread there. You can roll 1 die, and you never want to do that. You're only ever going to Spanner Strike for 1 die if something's kind of gone wrong on your turn. You always want to be able to spend the synth to roll 3 dice instead. And the perfect layout is a 1, 2, or 3, a 4 or 5, and a 6, which adds 3 damage to the attack, plus a synth. So if we're looking at that, we're actually looking at a 6, 7, 8 damage spread if the stars align. Now, they won't align every single time, but this is really, really easy to roll for. This is super easy to roll for. And once you also have the shock bot, you can add another 3 damage. So you're looking at essentially being able to add 6 damage to this attack pretty consistently, which is a huge amount of damage output. We're looking at 11 there. In its default state, Spanner Strike is already one of the best basic attacks in the entire game. And with its upgrade, it gets even better, which almost feels unfair. This upgrade takes us up to 4, 5, 6. And again, I fully concede that the printed damage numbers on this card are not that fantastic. It retains the roll 1 or spend a synth to roll 3, and then you can add 1, 2, 3 damage and potentially gain a synth off of those rider dice. This will not every time, but consistently be a 12 damage attack. You are essentially outfitted with a basic attack that can hit as harder than some characters' ults. This is very, very good damage production for the Artificer, and one of the most important abilities that he has on his entire board, whether you're on the aggressive track or the controlled track. This is more important for the aggressive track, but either way, Very, very strong power. Last comment on Spanner Strike. I have always been fond of, if I get all the wrenches, referring to that particular combination as a full toolbox, which is maybe a little corny. Even my 11-year-old laughs at me when I say that, but it's been something I've been fond of for a long time. And there's going to be a theme as I review this character of it having words that I enjoy saying as words, which, okay, that is a little silly. All right, let's move down and talk about another very important part of the Artificer class, and that is Scrap Collector. So this is the passive ability for the Artificer, and it's kind of the glue that holds his entire sub economy together. During your upkeep, you gain a Synth. If you pay 4 Synth at any time, you can inflict a Nanite on a chosen opponent. Now, in most matchups, the Nanite infliction for 4 Synth is too expensive and not impactful enough to really matter, but there are some particular matchups where having access to this, you're going to have an abundance of Synth and you're going to be able to spam Nanites at the opponent and blow them up. That is a way to close games out some of the time, but by far the more important text on Scrap Collector is, of course, the gain of Synth during the upkeep. Once we upgrade this ability, which costs 2 CP, which again, it's hard to rate the Artificer's combat point economy using familiar metrics across most of the characters. Most of his cards are cheaper than you would expect, and he has the ability to generate some combat points built into his board. So 2 cost for Artificer doesn't sound as expensive as it does with some other characters whose combat point generation is a lot more throttled. I think this is an upgrade you're almost always going to take, except towards the very end of the game where maybe there's only a few turns left, so you're going to have much less of a chance, and particularly if you have somewhere for that one other combat point to go. If you're throttled on combat points, this could be a safe sell, but particularly like turns 1, 2, 3, getting this down, the sooner you get this down in the game, the better. So what this allows you to do is roll a die. Instead of just gaining 1 Synth, you roll a die and you have a 50% chance of getting 2 Synth instead of 1, which is a pretty significant increase, especially if you are struggling to get those bots upgraded. This makes sure that your shock bot can activate every turn and you can do something else with your Synth. This is a really, really important power overall, and this upgrade I think is very strong, and one of the ones, if you see this in your opening hand, you feel really, really good as the Artificer player. This is a very important upgrade. Again, later in the game I think you can probably get away with selling it, but more often than not, this is a card that I play very quickly once I get it. Again, the sooner you play it in the game, the more value you're going to get out of it. I'm going to talk a little more in depth about the Nanite strategy later in the video, but at both the default level and the upgrade, you have the pay 4 Synth in order to inflict a Nanite on the chosen opponent. Next, we're going to move up to talking about Schematics. Now, this ability, in the same way that Spanner Strike was the backbone of the aggressive approach, Schematics is the backbone of your control approach. So the core appeal of Schematics, you draw 2 cards, which is great. Anytime you're drawing extra cards, that feels pretty good. And this is draw 2 extra cards, which is almost ridiculous. You heal 2 off of this. Now that is a small heal. Overall 2 hit points is not a massive heal effect, but when you combine this with the rest of his kit and look at the totality, for an aggressive character, there's actually a lot of healing built into the Artificer. And if you're going for that control approach, you're going to need every little bit of healing. This also lets you gain 4 Synth. That right there could be the 3rd Nanite that you need to put on something in order to pop off and do 5 damage, which would be a delta of 7 if you're looking at the heal for 2, and this enabling a Nanite detonation for 5. That's a pretty good attack. That is basically average damage for a hero, and you did it while drawing a couple cards and not giving your opponent's defense a chance to ever actually engage with what you're doing. If we take a look at the upgraded version of Schematics, you still gain 2 cards, you still gain 2 health, you still gain 4 Synth, and you also gain 2 combat points. Which, I mean, it's good. We can't deny that it's good, especially since the upgrade only costs once. If you activate it one time, it essentially paid for itself and then some, as well as all the other benefits. The thing here is, most of the time the Artificer is not going to be strapped for combat points. There are going to be some games where things just don't align and you're really struggling to get effects to the board because your combat point economy is struggling. But most of the time, if the Artificer is struggling, it's because you don't have the synth, not because you don't have the combat points. So is this upgrade worth it? Early game, probably, yes. Early game, you get that excess of combat points built up. You're able to play anything out of your hand. You never have any stress about it, especially maybe if you're in a matchup against a character who's stealing your combat points. I'm looking at you, Shadow Thief, maybe Curse Pirate. So in those matchups, maybe you value this upgrade more than others. I think most of the time this is probably a safe sell because the value you really need out of Schematics is already there at the default level. The 2 cards, the 2 health, and the 4 synth. The 2 CP, it's fine. It's certainly worth it if you get it down early in the game, but this is not an upgrade that I think is crucial to the Artificer's overall strategy. It's certainly not on the same level as like the Spanner Strike, which I think is absolutely core. All right, let's move down to Eureka. Now this is yet another bread and butter ability. This whole half of the board is all really important stuff for the Artificer. And this is an ability that I like saying, Eureka! It's just a fun word. As well as, this is a great ability. So 7 damage, that's kind of smack in the middle of what you want average damage output on a hero to be. And it gains you the 3 synth. So this supports your sub economy, allows you to activate a bot. If you didn't have the shock bot synth available, this gives it to you, makes this a 10 damage attack, and you've got some synth to spend on something else if you need it. So overall, this is a very, very strong power, and it's something you're going to be rolling a lot, particularly early in the game with the Artificer, and it's a power that matters whatever track you're on. You always want to be able to have some damage, and you always want to be able to have some synth. If you're really afraid of the opponent's defense, for whatever reason, you don't want to run into that Shadow Thief who's going to just drop shadows on you, or you're in kind of a weird race with a Pyromancer where the crackback that you can get off of their defense might be problematic, well then maybe you want to opt for Schematics over Eureka in those specific situations. But generally speaking, this is a power you're going to want to roll often. You're going to take it when you can, for sure. Looking at the upgrade here, it costs 2 CP. It only increases the damage by 1, which I don't think feels all that great. Yeah, this is a really important power, but you're paying 2 CP to increase the damage by 1. I don't know how into that I am. It adds the ability Scratch Built, which lets you build an advanced bot or upgrade a basic bot to advanced. Being able to skip right ahead to the advanced stage on one of your bots feels pretty good. So there are times where you might want to use this power, particularly to get the nanobot out later in the game. Generally speaking, if you've got the CP, I think you probably play this upgrade, even though it's not the greatest thing possible. But late game, once all your bots have already been built, you have no use for Scratch Build at all. And the 1 extra damage off to Eureka is probably not worth it. You could sell this and maybe put that CP somewhere else. But if you've already turned your combat point dial way up and you have no need for additional combat points, this is a fine card to play in most games. Although it's not, I do not think this is a must-play upgrade. It's fine to sell it, but I don't necessarily think it's a misplay to put this one on the board either. All right, so then we're going to move across the board here, and we're going to take a look at Jolt. So this is the small straight option for the Artificer. You gain a synth, you inflict a nanite, you deal 7 damage. 7 damage is average, that feels pretty good. Synth, you always want more synth. The nanite, again, with nanites, they're much, much less important than pretty much everything else the character does, except for those times where they're super important. So it's hard to value the nanite without getting into really match-specific commentary. Taking a look at the upgrade here, costs you 2 to get into play. Again, that's probably fine for this character. You still gain a synth, and now you inflict 2 nanites instead of 1, and deal 7 damage. The nuts and bolts gain 5 synth. You don't ever want to have to do that. Nuts and bolts is there. This is what you call when your schematics roll went horribly wrong, or you realize after the fact, oh crap, that guy's in the shadows, I can't do my Spanner Strike. So something has to have kind of gone wrong for you to ever want to do nuts and bolts. I will say 5 synth is inarguably better than saying I scratch, but it's still not very good. So I don't think the nuts and bolts adds much to this at all. And the additional nanite for 2 CP, that feels pretty terrible. I think this upgrade is almost always a safe sell. Sure, if it's late in the game and it's a game where you've been playing aggressive, but you've got the extra combat points and you realize a nanite lethal is within grasp, and you don't have anything else to do, if this is the last card in your hand, this is better served staying in your hand and making your opponent think about, hey, is that a twice as wild? Hey, is that a helping hand? Is that any, not this time, whatever. It's probably better bluffing that this is a card that matters. Otherwise, if you have other cards in your hand, you have other options, you just sell this thing and never think about it again. I don't really like this upgrade. Okay, so now we'll move down to the large straight, and like most large straights, this one is pretty good. So it starts with inflict a nanite, and then it says deal 9 damage and activate any one bot. So just to be clear, when you activate a bot, and it says right there on the ability, ignore normal activation requirements, that means you could activate your nanites right now, even though normally you can't do it except during the upkeep. You could activate your heal bot here, and you could do your 9 damage and then pick up some healing and make an even bigger delta there, even though normally you can't activate your heal bot except during defense, except when they attack you for 6. You could also use this to activate your shock bot for free, although that probably feels the worst because most of the time what you want to have happen is you declare this ability, you activate either heal or nanobot, and then you pay the one measly synth to activate your shock bot yourself. Having to rely on a board-based bot activation for something as core to the Artificer's identity as activating the shock bot probably means things aren't going well for you. That probably means there's something wrong in your synth production, either because your opponent got a well-timed what status effects, or they've attacked your hand in such a way that you weren't able to play the ooh shinies or whatever. Overall, this is a very, very strong large straight on a character whose board is very sturdy already. When we take a look at the upgrade, you now get 2 synth plus a nanite and the 9 damage. Swarming bots allows you to deal 5 damage plus 1 for each bot you have built, which at the point of the game where you would ever declare that, hopefully that's 8 attack, which is still fine. So as a backup ability, that's actually not bad at all. It is kind of capped hard at 8 because there's only 3 bots, and it gets much worse the lower down that you go. But if you have the 3 bots, you're going to pay 1, and that 8 is going to get plus 3'd right there, and now you're attacking with like the strength of an ultimate again, because shock bot is amazing. The 2 cost, I've said multiple times, I don't think 2 cost is a big deal for this character in particular, although depending upon the specific fabric of your hand and the overall game, there can be times where 2 cost is a little rough to get to. Overall, I actually like this upgrade, generally speaking. Super late game, you probably don't need it anymore. But that is actually where it's best. So if you're going to play this, I would probably say you want to play it earlier in the game so that it's there for you in the late game. Once you get down to those like near lethal turns, you've probably got somewhere else to put your CP, like into a dice fix card or the not this time that you're camping on in your hand because your defense roll isn't very good. Overall, though, I think you probably play the Zap upgrade more games than you don't, but this is one of those ones where it could kind of go either way. You just have to get familiar with the character and know where you're at with him. This is kind of a worse Eureka in a way. You're getting less synth, but you're doing a little more damage. Also, a large straight's probably harder to roll than that full house combination. So overall, this is kind of like a backup Eureka, so to speak, as an ability. And again, swarming bots is totally playable. So this is a card I don't mind upgrading, assuming, of course, that I don't have other cards in my hand that are fighting for that same combat point. If playing this means I can't play twice as wild during the roll phase, then maybe this sits in my hand for a turn, or maybe it gets sold to help me push for that victory. It does with the Artificer, again, you have to keep in mind what track you're on. If you're on the damage track, if you can't play an upgrade this turn, you have to really have a conversation with yourself. Am I going to have time to play it next turn? If I don't, could I use this CP now and sell it? Not nearly as extreme as, say, like the Barbarian, a character who I don't really feel like you need to play many of his upgrades, like ever, because it's so important to be able to put those resources, that combat point value, into paying for his cards and the neutral kit stuff. Artificer doesn't really fall into that kind of category where you have to sell his upgrades, but this is one where if you really need the CP, you can get away with this and not feel bad. If you're in the position where you're looking at like selling Spanner Strike or something like that, that feels pretty terrible. Even though this is a generally solid upgrade, I think you can sell it and not feel like you threw the game or something. All right, so let's move up into the corner and take a look at our mini alt. This is Overclock, 6 undefendable damage, and activate up to 2 bots. So 6 will never be 6, it will always be 9 unless something really weird has happened. It would take a very strange string of events to not have your shock bot out while you're declaring your Overclock. Because the first thing you do every game, first main phase, is you build that shock bot. It is so important to the game plan. Yeah, this is a good ability. Is this something you should be chasing with your Artificer? Absolutely not. You have much bigger damage. Even if your opponent has a great defense, Spanner Strike putting 12 damage on the chain, I mean, it's going to take them a not this time to get it down to this undefendable damage level. So whether they're achieving that with damage reduction through their dice roll or through cards or whatever, it's still going to take a lot for them to get there. This ability's fine. Taking a look at the upgrade, you get the power-up ability, which only takes 3 6s. So this would be the kind of thing you would only declare if you were going for an ult and your opponent twice as wild you and you couldn't get it back, or something's went wrong if you're declaring this 3/6 ability. It allows you to inflict 3 nanites on a chosen opponent. I will say there is a very narrow band of plays where you actually want to inflict the 3 nanites. And again, this comes back to the control style Artificer who's trying to avoid directly engaging with the opponent's defense. That right there basically says deal 5 damage. You inflict 3 nanites as long as the opponent doesn't remove them during their turn. And it's like 5 damage like on a delay, so it's kind of like a delayed poison from the ninja if you think about it that way. But it is obviously a lot more fragile, and it's not automatic. You do have to have that synth, and you have to remember to say, hey, I'm going to spend this during the upkeep before you draw your card and gain your coin for turn. The upgraded version of the Overclock allows you to inflict a nanite. You're still doing 6 undefendable damage, which of course will turn into 9 with the shock bot, and then you get to activate 2 different bots. I don't like this upgrade very much at all. Yeah, there's always going to be something better you can do with those 2 combat points. There's just no situation where I feel like this card really earns its place. I guess if you are at the state of the game where all your bots are built and you've got all the coins ever in your coin purse and you just want something to do. But if this is the last card in your hand, again, I think it's better served as a bluff to make your opponent think about, hey, what is he holding? Could it be helping hand? Could it be whatever? Than it is putting this thing out on the board. Like, this is an ability you don't really want to roll for. You're probably only activating these if you missed the ult or got your dice messed with by the opponent. Yeah, I think even though this character has all the combat points in the world and super cheap cards, I think this is an upgrade that just probably doesn't make the cut in the majority of games. Moving down to Ratchet up. All right, so this is another kind of key part of the Artificer's synth production, only it's a much less reliable one. So on the opposite side of the board, we took a look at Scrap Collector. This gets you 1 synth, or with the upgrade, potentially 2 synth, about half the time. This is going to get you, on average, probably around 2 synth. But it's not going to be a consistent 2, so you can't go into your turn thinking, all right, my healbot payment is going to come from my defense every time. It just isn't. The nanite being inflicted, sometimes it matters a lot. Most of the time nanites don't matter that much, except maybe once at the very end of the game while you push for lethal. I do kind of like making people afraid of the nanites. It is funny how people will sometimes overreact to it, particularly with defensive nanites, and waste their status removal on trying to like get rid of this thing, or be clever and put a nanite back on you as the Artificer, which, by the way, if you detonate nanites, you detonate all the nanites. So if one's been transferenced onto you, you will take a damage off of that. But I don't think you feel bad about that at all. If somebody used transference to mess with a nanite rather than mess with your synth, you're money ahead, baby. Like, as Artificer, you feel good. So the upgraded version of this defense costs 3, which is his most expensive upgrade, and it's probably worth it anyway. It gives you the ability to put some damage output on the opponent. Admittedly, it's not very much. It's a maximum of 1, and it requires 2 of your dice to cooperate. It also lets you inflict multiple nanites per defensive roll, although your mileage may vary with how useful those are, and you can still continue to gain synth. Clearly, late in the game, if you're only going to have a couple more defense rolls and you need this combat point to go somewhere else, I can justify selling this card after like turn 4, turn 5, somewhere in that range. You're unlikely to get a lot of value out of it. At the same time, late in the game is where 1 damage can mean the difference between loss and success, or loss and a draw. So this is a card I do like to play this. When I see Ratchet upgrade as an Artificer player, I feel good about it, and I do try to get it to the board, but I definitely prioritize it lower than some of the other upgrades that I have access to, particularly Spanner Strike. Especially considering its cost, although again, Artificer is a character where the cost of a card is not going to matter as much as maybe some other characters. Moving on to the ultimate, we are looking at maximum power. When you trigger this ultimate, you gain 2 synth, inflict a nanite, and deal 10 damage, and then you get to activate 2 different bots. Now that 10 damage should never ever under any circumstances be 10. Even if you don't have any synth going into the roll, you gain 2 synth off of this. So that should be 10 plus 3 from Shockbot, and potentially plus another 1 from the nanobot. You're inflicting a nanite with this. Even if you don't have any other nanites on the opponent, the nanobot, you get to activate 2 bots for free. So Healbot, sure, you gain a little bit of healing. Shockbot, probably pay for that out of the synth that you gained off the activation of the ability. And finally, nanobot. So this is a pretty consistent 14 damage, but it could actually spike even higher than that, because if your opponent has 2 nanites, you're going to be doing 3 damage instead. And if they already have, with the application of this, if this is their second, it's 3 damage instead. And if they already have 2 on them, when you activate this power, they now have 3. You're attacking for 10. You're activating Shockbot for 3. You're activating Nanobot for another 5, which is a huge swing. That's a massive ultimate. Now, are you chasing ultimates with this character? I don't think so. I think the place you want to invest a lot of your dice fix resources is early, either on Eurekas or Schematics. Prior to getting your bots up and running, you want to put your resources into guaranteeing that you can get that early synth. And before we get into the neutral cards, I am going to talk for a little bit about counterplay and play with the Artificer. So the counterplay, the number one best thing you can do if you're facing an Artificer is attack his synth economy. And the number one best way you can do that is to go first. Can't control that, really, but go first, attack, let him gain whatever synth he's going to gain off of his defense roll, and then once he has that, you play what status effects and wipe that board. This totally destroys the Artificer's ability to build their Shockbot turn 1, potentially build and upgrade their Shockbot turn 1, which should always be your priority as the Artificer player. Even if you're pretty sure you're going to go down the control track, there is an argument for ordering your bots Healbot then Shockbot if you are going down the control track, but I still think Shockbot's just got to be the way to go. No matter how you play this character, even if your focus is going to be on trying to heal and do indirect damage that doesn't engage with the opponent's defense, this is dice throne. This is a fist fight. We go back and forth, and even the most control play is still going to occasionally have to pop off an attack and send some damage across the board. And when you do that, you want it to be 3 bigger. You just always want it to be 3 bigger, no matter what else is going on. So in my opinion, I say you basically always build and upgrade Shockbot turn 1. Maybe in some matchups, there's an argument for prioritizing Healbot over Shockbot, but I don't agree with those arguments. They exist, but I don't agree with those arguments. Nanobot almost always should be the last bot that you upgrade, and generally speaking, if you are to the point where you're already set up on your shocks and your heals, you've probably at some point in the game rolled your way into building a bot for free or discounted. That's very likely. And if you're focused on Eurekas and Schematics, then you probably have a synth surplus. So there does come a point in the game where building that last bot or upgrading that last bot doesn't feel like it's actually asking that much of you. On the aggro track, that's the point of the game where your nanites need to start looking for lethal. And if you're on the control track, you're probably already using your nanites to their maximum potential, just dumping the synth into that. So let's move on to talk about the last parts of the Artificer's card kit. So we're going to talk about high voltage. This costs 1 coin. It gains you 2 synth. You play this every game. Maybe there's an argument for having a little bit of like finesse in your play around this card, where maybe you play this during the defense phase. Your opponent who thought they were going to sneak an attack in and not let you activate your heal bot off of it, now all of a sudden you have the resources to activate your heal bot twice. Maybe there's an argument that you play this during an upkeep phase, so you can activate a nano bot out of nowhere, but you pretty much are always, under all circumstances, in every game, going to be playing high voltage if you draw it. Your synth economy is just too important. Even if this card costs 2, you'd probably still play it. But fortunately, it does not. It costs 1. Artificer's blessed with a lot of cheap cards, and this one is no exception. Synth is an important resource. I think you play this card every game. Ooh Shiny. So this is a free card that acts essentially the same as a Vegas Baby, but for Synth. Again, you're going to play this every time. Synth is just too important. There may be some finesse in when you play it. You don't necessarily slam this as soon as you see it, because they're, like I outlined talking about the previous card, there are times where getting that surprise effect on your opponent, oh, I didn't think you were going to be able to heal out there, that might be important. So really the only question about Ooh Shiny is, when do I play it, not do I play it. Nanite Assault, so if you draw this early game, you sell it immediately. You don't even think about it. It doesn't matter what track you're on, you just sell it. Late game, this is a card that you could deploy during your opponent's upkeep to get that one last nanite and push that 5 damage through instead of 3, which could push for lethal. And those types of outs are things you want to start looking for as you get into the like 6th or 7th turn of the game. But generally speaking, this is a card that if you have any pressure at all on your coins, you sell this card, spend the coin on where you need that to go to get that important upgrade, or to play something else, a dice fix card, anything else. Again, the majority of the time, this card is a sell, but there are narrow bands of board states where this could be the difference between winning and losing if you're able to get that one last nanite on there and push that damage through that your opponent doesn't have the ability to respond to. So it's fine. It's fine. Conductivity. So this is a 0-cost card. You roll a die and you can either gain 2 coins, which is probably not something you need that often as Artificer. You can gain a synth, which probably is what you need most, or you can inflict a nanite. If paying 1 to inflict a nanite is a most of the time sell, paying 0 to inflict a nanite is probably fine too. It is a little weird with this card that you don't actually want the 6 probably ever. Of course, I can construct a scenario where you would want the 6. Your opponent has 2 nanites, they have 4 health, and it's your upkeep. So in that case, you would want the 6. But the majority of the time when you play this, I think you're probably looking for either the combat points and more likely the synth. This is a card you're going to play far more often than you're ever going to sell it. Although, in the same way there might be a corner case where you want the 6 for the nanite, there might be a corner case where you have to sell this card in order to pay for another more important or more consistent effect, and that's totally fine. Generally speaking, though, this is a card I typically play, and I'm typically happy with the synth I get from it. Arcane Shield. So this costs nothing. It prevents 2 damage, and if you spend a synth on it, it prevents 3 damage instead. So this is pretty much always half and not this time for a 100% discount. This is not a super strong defense card, but it's one of the strongest defense cards this character has. So this by itself would not be good enough. But when you combine it with the fact that the Artificer is likely healing little bits throughout the whole game and chipping away at the work the opponent's doing, having half a not this time for no combat points is a pretty solid investment for the Artificer. I think most games you're going to play this card if you see it, and most of the time you're probably going to commit the synth to it. So you've got to, as always, as the pilot of an Artificer, you have to keep an eye on your economy basically all the time, and having the synth available to make sure you get the full value out of the Arcane Shield, I think more often than not is going to be worth it. I think you're going to be rewarded by investing that synth in the shield, for even though it's only 1 extra. I totally understand how if you compare that 1 synth investment to 1 activation of Shockbot, that is a pretty terrible rate of exchange. I can spend 1 synth on a Shockbot, and that's 3 damage. So that pushes me 3 points towards winning the game. And spending 1 synth here pushes me 1 point away from losing the game. So it is a much worse rate of return than your Shockbot. But given the overall way the Artificer plays, I think it's probably a place where you're not going to feel bad about investing your synth ever. I think you do it almost every time. Very narrow exception would be if your synth economy is under tremendous pressure and you simply don't have the 1 to spare. Like spending the 1 here and that making it so you can't activate your nanobot for lethal on the next turn. That's a really, really extreme like corner case, but those are the kinds of examples that I think you have to kind of reach for when you start talking about not investing the synth in this card. It's got to be some pretty specific and pretty impactful things that are going to happen if you don't. Next up, we have Robo Revenge. So this costs a coin, prevent 2 damage, and inflict a nanite. So this is really similar to the card we just talked about. Arguably worse, almost certainly worse. But even if you're on the control track and you're getting a bunch of value out of your nanites, I think you care more about the 3 defense. I think you care more about trying to stay alive longer, which this card, Arcane Shield, is better at helping you with than Robo Revenge is. So this is just, it's fine. I mean, you're going to play it because you've got to play it. Like you have to stay alive. It's not a bad card. It's not a bad return on your investment. It's just a little bit counterintuitive to overall what I think you probably want to be doing as the Artificer, which is putting big damage in your opponent's face and kind of fiddling with their attacks. I mean, this is a little fiddling with their attacks, but if this gave me a synth instead of a nanite, I would like it a lot more. Finally, we have the promo card. Like all promo cards, it costs 0. It's a main phase card. You roll 1 die. If you get a 6, you get something really good. In the case of the Artificer, you gain 5 synth. That is very good. Or you draw a card. I definitely care more about the synth than the card. Pretty much all these promo cards are built that way. But drawing, like if the worst thing that happens is this card replaces itself with something else, that's fine. All right, so overall, let's kind of run down Artificer strategy one last time. And let's start with the aggressive track. So the aggressive way you play Artificer, and I think this is the way you play him in almost every matchup. He can definitely outrace Pyro. He can get there. He can outrace like Shadow Thief getting set up. He can beat down a lot of these characters before they have any opportunity to really respond. And you do that by slamming your foot on the gas. You build and upgrade your Shockbot on turn 1. You get to the heal bot as quickly as you can. You never declare an attack where you don't have the synth to activate the Shockbot. You are largely doing things like Eureka, but targeting Spanner Strike. You're throwing those toolboxes at your opponent. Occasionally, maybe you'll get a mini ult or an ult or a straight, but none of those are crucial to your overall game plan. Your most important upgrade on aggro track has to be Scrap Collector and Spanner Strike. Those are the 2 that really matter. Scrap Collector probably less than Spanner Strike. I think Spanner Strike is the most important card for the aggressive track, but the extra synth that Scrap Collector provides, as well as the extra synth that the defense upgrade can put, as well as the benefits that the defense upgrade can give you. I think those 3 upgrades are the ones you really want to look for when you are on the aggressive track. If you come into the match and you're looking across the table at something like a Huntress or maybe even a Ninja, where their defense could be a little more dangerous for you, Samurai kind of falls in this bucket too. One of these characters where they can chip you up and prevent damage on your attacks, and maybe attacking is not as safe as you'd like it to be. These are the games or the portions of games where you can flip into control mode. And control mode, the backbone of this is schematics. It's super important to hit schematics multiple times. Even if your overall game plan is aggro mode, a turn 1 schematics feels pretty good. That gives you a lot of gas. The biggest weakness of aggro play is that you run out of gas towards the end of the game. If you start the game with Artificer and you draw a bunch of extra cards, get a little bit of extra health, and get a ton of your sub-economy resources, you are probably going to win. You are in great shape to win. Now, there's no guarantees in Dice Throne, of course, but to set the table for ourselves as best as possible, a turn 1 activate of schematics or Eureka is good regardless of track. After turn 1, if you're on the control track, I do think you're going to be looking to activate schematics a lot more frequently than the aggressive player would, and you're going to be dumping your synth into nanites a lot more than the aggressive player would. In the aggro mode, you're probably going to activate nanites once the entire game, and that's probably going to be your push for lethal. In control mode, chipping away at the opponent with nanites, even if you don't always wait for the full 5, if you take the 3 here, you take the 3 there, those numbers start to add up. And as your opponent's attacking into you, if you're healing 2, 3 off of Healbot every time they attack, their attacks look smaller, and even though you're not putting big damage on them, the nanites are chipping them down. And if you are spending your turns activating things like schematics, then you're going to be healing as well, which puts even more pressure, downward pressure on the overall damage numbers that your opponent's getting across. Now, if you're fighting an Artificer, I already mentioned it once, what status effects is absolutely your friend. The earlier in the game you get it, the better, particularly if you get it turn 1. I think it's crucial, absolutely crucial with the Artificer that you do not get distracted by nanites. You cannot waste status removal on nanites, even if it's clear that the Artificer is trying to do a schematics heavy nanite bomb approach to the game. I think you have to attack their synth. Nanites can't do anything without synth, and synth has versatility for the Artificer across different things. If the Artificer gets keen that you're trying to prevent the nanites from blowing up, he could at any moment just roll a spanner strike instead. It's super easy to hit a full toolbox, and when you do, you can put an alt's worth of damage across the board. So even as a control player, having the ability to out of nowhere flip into aggro mode and burst for a big chunk of damage, if your opponent's using their status removal to mess with your nanites, you feel great about that. So if you're playing against the Artificer, don't fall into that trap. Save your status removal for the more important thing, the synth. Do everything you can to prevent the Artificer from getting set up behind his bots. Once the bots are in place, the Artificer is... It's like once a Shadow Thief has 15 CP. Like, you know you're in trouble. The big flashing warning lights are going off. We're in code red. Like, it's a big hole to dig out of once the Artificer gets set up. And it's really hard to race him and kill him before he gets set up, because so much of his stuff is cheap and fast. The only thing you can do to really disrupt the Artificer's game plan, and this is a lot more, if you compare him to like what I consider the number 2 aggro character in the game, Pyromancer, attacking the Pyromancer's Fire Mastery is much less impactful and problematic for the Pyromancer than attacking the synth production is for the Artificer. That is the key to this entire character. Even if you are not in depth enough with how this character is played to really recognize the differences between the 2 tracks, it doesn't matter. You don't have to recognize the differences. You just have to focus on kicking those legs, those synth legs, out from underneath his bot chair. How's that for a mixed metaphor? And as long as you're doing that while also applying some damage, you're probably in good shape. If it's turn 3, turn 4, and the Artificer still doesn't have their bots built, you are very likely to win that game. Now, again, there's no guarantees in Dice Throne, but all we can do is set the table for ourselves and take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. And if you're drawing status removal against this hero, you want to be using that status removal to get rid of those synth. That's the most critical part of playing against this character. Okay, this guy's one of my absolute favorites. He's my top 3 heroes in the entire game, and definitely my favorite guy out of the Season 2 battle chest. So this was a really fun one for me, and beats close to my mechanical heart. All right, until next time, go win some games.